Hi guys, this video is on changing ecosystems and it is part 2. So make sure that you've gone back and had a look at part 1, which goes through the ideas of ecological succession and also enables you to differentiate between primary and secondary succession. So let's look at what this video is going through today. So the first thing is to identify the features of pioneer species. And these include things like the ability to fixate nitrogen, tolerance to extreme conditions, rapid germination of seeds, and the ability to photosynthesise. Now, those specific features, they're things that make these pioneer species effective colonisers, and we'll look at why. The second one is to analyse ecological data to predict temporal and spatial successional changes. Now, I've kind of jumped over the fourth learning goal if you've looked, but I just think this flows better and leads in quite nicely from the other one there. So to start with, let's do a quick recap to make sure that you understand what was covered last lesson or last video. So the first practice question is to explain the process of primary succession on a newly formed island from volcanic eruptions. So this is going to be worth 4 marks. So obviously pause the video now if you want to have a go, and then I'll go through a bit of an answer on the next slide that goes to that. So make sure you do have a chance to have a go or think through yourself. So the answer to this, and I'll go through how I'd be giving some marks. So initially, living pioneer species such as lichen that do not need soil to survive arrive. Now I'll give you 1 mark for acknowledging pioneer species. That's a key idea when explaining the stages of succession, and that was set out in that last learning goals that we did before on the other video, which showed that you need to understand this idea of pioneer species. So soil then begins to form as lichens and forces of weather and erosion break down the rocks into smaller pieces. When lichens die, they decompose, adding small amounts of organic matter to the rock to make soil. I'll give you 1 mark for acknowledging this process of making the soil. So then simple plants like mosses and ferns are able to grow in the newly formed soil, aided by their reproductive method of, say, spores. Okay, as these plants die, more organic matter is added to the soil. As the soil layer thickens, grass and wildflowers begin to take over. And again, these plants die, adding more organic matter to the soil, allowing shrubs and trees to start to grow. So I'll give you 1 mark for acknowledging this process of grasses and wildflowers coming into the air, and then trees and shrubs. So these intermediate stages, these sears, acknowledging them. Eventually, a climax community will be reached, and that's your other mark, acknowledging that climax community there. So hopefully you've understood that idea of primary succession. You start with the pioneers, plants, then you've got your different sears, okay, so your grasses, your trees and shrubs, and eventually ending in your climax community. The second practice question is explain what type of succession has occurred here. So again, pause the video, have a go yourself, and I'll go through the answer. So the type of succession that has occurred here is secondary succession. And we can see that initially, if you look, we've started with plant material. It's not bare ground or rock or soil, so you know straight away it's secondary succession. So here you've got these crops. They've been harvested at CO2, so this stage 2, destroying the crops. As there is soil remaining, it is not primary succession, as that's one of the key differences between primary and secondary succession. In secondary succession, you have soil present, where in primary, you're starting from bare rock. So over time, pioneer species are replaced by other species, and eventually you end in our climax community. So for 3 marks, 1, you acknowledge it's secondary succession. 2, you acknowledge why it can't be primary succession because of the fact that there was soil present. And 3, you acknowledge that eventually it ends in a climax community there. Okay, so let's look at these features of pioneer species now that you've hopefully got that understanding of the 2 types of successions. So pioneer species, as you know, they have a variety of features which make them effective colonisers. So what I mean by colonisers is they can start and establish themselves in a new area, paving the way for other species later to come in. So the features we're going to look at, 1, the ability to fixate nitrogen, 2, tolerance to extreme conditions, 3, rapid germination of seeds, and 4, the ability to photosynthesize. So let's go through those different ones. So some pioneer species form a symbiotic relationship with nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And if you remember from the nitrogen cycle, these are bacteria that are able to convert atmospheric nitrogen N2 into different nitrogenous compounds. So one of them being ammonia or NH3. And that's a form that the plant can therefore use, because plants can't use that atmospheric nitrogen, that N2. Nitrogen is an essential macronutrient for plants. In fact, as far as those sort of macronutrients there, it is the most essential. And in Australia, it's quite low in our soils. So by having this ability to fixate nitrogen, these plants are able to grow and develop in areas that are very low in nutrients in that soil. If they didn't have that ability to fixate nitrogen, well, it'd be very difficult to get the nutrients required to establish yourself, particularly on that bare ground that some organisms like lichen are establishing themselves in. So the other thing to look at is pioneer plants are hardy and tolerant to extreme conditions. And this is basically through the adaptations that they have. So you take big spinifex, which is a pioneer plant on the sand dune. Now it will have these long spreading roots that are all able to cover a large area, which stabilizes them on that sand dune. They form runners, they're low growing, and they tend to have tough leathery leaves. They also have those hairs to reflect sunlight to not get too hot, and they'll have a lot of stomatal adaptations, which you would have looked at previously in year 11, like having sunken stomata, again those epidermal hairs, creating those pits, and they even roll and curl their leaves to again increase the water potential around the stomata to reduce the amount of water loss via transpiration. So all of these features enable them to have a greater chance of surviving in these harsh environments. If they weren't able to tolerate extreme conditions, well, they wouldn't be these pioneer species plants, simply because a pioneer plant is one that's going to establish itself in the harshest of the conditions. From then on, it gets better because they're adding extra nutrients. There's more soil forming. There's greater amount of nutrients available, particularly as those plants are broken down and decomposed, adding that extra nutrients there. So these plants have to be able to tolerate those extreme conditions. So pioneer plants also tend to have rapid germination of seeds, and this enables them to quickly establish themselves in the harsh environmental conditions. So if you're a pioneer plant and you're arriving in an environment which may only have a brief period that is suitable, it might be rain, you need to develop quickly and establish yourself to ensure that you can actually take advantage of any conditions that might be most beneficial at that time. So they tend to have that rapid germination of seeds, and these seeds also tend to be blown by the wind. And you'll also find that pioneer species tend to produce a large amount of seeds, and that ties into the fact that they generally are selected species. So to remember back, those are species that disperse rapidly, okay? So they produce, so once they develop, they produce a large amount of offspring very quickly, and they tend to have a short life cycle. And that all suits to being in the pioneer plant. By being able to disperse rapidly, you're going to have a great ability to colonize that area, and having that short life cycle, well, you've established, you've developed, you can pass on, and you're going to get that, I guess, more rapid expansion in that area. That's why these plants, pioneer plants, tend to have what we call that J-shaped growth, okay? They're exponential growth because they get in, they establish themselves, they grow really quickly, produce a lot of offspring. However, over time, they tend to get outcompeted by those longer-lived K-selected species there. So pioneer plants also have the ability to photosynthesise, and this allows them to produce their own chemical energy, and that is essential. You're getting into an environment which has very little nutrients, or when you're considering primary succession, just bare rock. So these plants need to be able to produce their own glucose for cellular respiration to produce energy. So some of those pioneer pioneer species like lichen, you can see here lichen, they're a composite organism. So they're made up of fungal hyphae and also algal cells and sometimes cyanobacteria. And they have the ability, these algal cells of the cyanobacteria, to photosynthesize, which therefore produces the glucose for cellular respiration. And lichen is that real classic pioneer species when we're talking about primary succession. Obviously, pioneer species for secondary succession isn't lichen because you don't have bare rock. You're looking at those grasses there. And again, those grasses have those same sort of features, rapid seed germination, and also the ability, of course, to photosynthesize as they are plants. So let's have a look at a practice question just to make sure you get these ideas and you can do it. You've listened to what's been said. Again, pause the video, go through these questions and see how they compare to my answers. So I want you to explain why pioneer species have the following characteristics that make them effective colonisers. Now I know the literacy isn't to explain, but by being able to explain these features, you're going to have a greater understanding of how they do impact those pioneer organisms. So the first one's ability to fixate nitrogen, tolerance to extreme conditions, rapid germination seeds, and ability to photosynthesize. So let's look at those features. So the first one, ability to fix nitrogen. Well, as I've mentioned, this is important for them because nitrogen is an essential nutrient for growth and development of a plant. So soils low in nitrogen make it hard for plants to grow or those organisms to establish themselves. So being able to fix nitrogen that's not readily available in the low nutrient soils enable these plants to grow and develop, and they help provide essential nutrients for other later plants that colonize. Because as they break down and decompose, that nitrogen which they've been able to fixate, which is in their plant tissue, is able to be returned to the soil there. So that's a very important feature of a pioneer species. Second one, tolerance to extreme conditions. Well, pioneer species being able to tolerate extreme environmental conditions means they are more likely to survive the harsh conditions which are often present at the beginning of this succession. Okay, so if you get a newly colonized area, particularly glacial retreat or volcanic eruption, you're going to have quite harsh conditions, low nutrients, low water availability, generally high temperatures as well, depending where you are on the continent. Sometimes for Arctic zones, you're not going to have those high temperatures, but you will have those low water availability and low nutrients. The other thing is rapid germination of seeds. So by being able to rapidly germinate seeds, it means that if conditions are good for a plant, they can begin to grow quickly. And that is important because you don't want to be able to, not be growing or establishing yourself, because those environmental conditions can change quickly, particularly in those bare environments where water will not last and remain a long time on bare rock. So this also helps pioneer species, obviously, to colonize the area quicker. Okay, by this rapid germination of seed and then rapid growth, they produce more seeds and then can therefore spread and colonize that area faster. And that again adds more nutrients to the soil, which helps them grow and establish. And then later on, other organisms to be able to come in and establish themselves or colonize that area. And the last one is the ability to photosynthesize. So being able to photosynthesize means pioneer species can produce their own food, and that might be limited in those newly colonized areas. So being able to produce your own food is very important for those pioneer organisms. Next thing, so we're going on to our next learning goal, which is all about predicting successional change. So ecological data is analysed and used to develop models that allow scientists to predict successional changes in ecosystems over space and time. So we call that the spatio-temporal. Now, if you've forgotten what those ideas are, so if we look at temporal changes, because you need to be able to predict over spatial and temporal changes, temporal changes are changes that will occur over time in that ecosystem. So over time, you might get an abundance of different organisms. Say, initially, you might get those weeds, so those short-lived herbaceous plants, particularly initially in secondary succession. Then you get some of those early successional trees, and then those later successional trees may come in, like your sugar maples in this ecosystem here, though establishing that climax community. So they are temporal changes, those changes that are going to occur in succession over time. The other things are spatial changes, so changes over space, so the area. And that will obviously change and develop as new organisms come and establish themselves, and then you spread. Okay, so that idea of succession will change over space. So to predict the stage of succession in a habitat, data on the number of features is collected and analysed. So QCA has set out some guidance of the features that they want you to look at. So I'm just going to go through them. So it might be useful for you to copy this table down. Now, the type of species present. Obviously, if the type of species present are those pioneer species, you know that succession is in its early stages. If you look at primary succession, well, you're going to have a greater amount of those R-selected species. Those organisms will tend to be smaller in size than those faster growing organisms, because remember, you're establishing or starting out on that bare ground. Or in secondary succession, you're going to have a greater amount of those K-selected organisms, so those slower growing organisms that will establish and outcompete those other organisms. They tend to be larger in size, and obviously, as I mentioned, that's slower growing. Biodiversity. So if you've got biodiversity that's quite low, you're probably at the beginning stages in both successions, okay? So more towards that earlier stage. If biodiversity is quite high, well, you're more towards that latter stage of succession, heading towards that climax community. In primary succession, generally you will have a lower amount of biodiversity, again starting on bare ground, and also in secondary succession it will be higher because you've got that soil there. It's the same with biomass, okay? So biomass, the amount of living material there, tends to be lower in primary succession and higher in secondary succession. And the same idea that biomass will increase generally as the trend over that time of succession. Biotic interactions, well, in primary succession, because you've got fewer or less biodiversity, you tend to have simpler interactions between the living organisms, okay? You'll tend to have a certain amount of food chains that contain common organisms. Or in secondary succession, you're going to have more complex interactions because you have a larger diversity. So you'll have more food webby type things operating where there's a lot more going on within that ecosystem. Abiotic interactions, well, in primary succession, you're going to have small amounts of poor quality soil, you'll have lower nutrient levels, unused resources and living spaces, and conditions which are relatively unstable. In secondary succession, you'll have a larger amount of good quality soil and nutrients, resources and living spaces in demand, and more stable conditions. So think about those ideas here. So the type of species present, for you to be able to make predictions on the stage of succession and also where things will be going. Biodiversity, biomass, biotic interactions, and abiotic interactions. They're all things that you need to understand to help you make some predictions on successional change. So if we look at this, so over time, and we've kind of looked at it, some of the following successional changes can occur. All right, so these are the general things that you'll be able to look at, and I'm making assumptions. Now, in every community, there are different things that can result, which can change these, but these are some general trends or predictions. As shown on here. So the amount of K-selected species will increase. And you can see initially here, over time, so this temporal stage here, you've got mosses and grasses, and here you've got some grasses and some other herbaceous organisms. So you can look that they're more R-selected species. Then you eventually get fast-growing trees, and in this community itself, you've got a climax community, so more K-selected species. Now, as I said, different ecosystems, say on the prairie, well, it may only ever get to having grasses because you've got so many herbivores that are eating different plant material that it never has a chance to reach a climax forest. Okay, so you can see here, basic trend, you get more K-selected species over time as time increases. Biodiversity and biomass, we can see over time that's increasing as a general trend. Again, you may get a dip and it decreases down here because at one stage you had a large amount of biodiversity due to the particular species that inhabited that area, and over time as that forest starts to shade those plants out, you will get a slight reduction in biodiversity of plants. You may get a greater amount of biodiversity of animals though being able to inhabit that particular environment. Abiotic conditions will change. Now obviously here, bare ground, you're going to get a high amount of sunlight. It's going to be obviously high temperatures, okay, lower water, lower nutrient availability. As you can see over time, the soil layer is going to increase, and you can see it increasing here, which means you're going to have a greater water holding capacity, great amount of nutrients, and also as you have trees growing, you'll get more shade, which will create an environment that is better suited for those different plants to grow in those specific conditions. So there are things you can use to help predict, and of course increased species interaction. The greater the amount of organisms that come into that environment, the more interactions that will be occurring. So the idea to understand here is that if you can have a knowledge of the abiotic conditions and the roles of some of those species in this idea of succession, well, you can use that knowledge to make predictions about successional outcomes. One example is Fraser Island. Now, Fraser Island is the largest sand island in the world, and it is the only sand island in the world that contains rainforest. And it is because of that size that it's able to do that. Now, what happens during succession on the sand dune is you'll initially get those pioneer plants. So you're looking at those plants like spinifex, pig's face, goat's foot, and they're going to establish themselves on that sand dune. They're going to stabilize the sand dune. They're going to add important nutrients to the soil. You'll then begin to get and grow and develop different plants like acacias, okay, so wattles, and you'll get casuarinas. Now, they contain nitrogen-fixing bacteria in their roots, which helps them grow in that low nutrient soil, but it will also therefore add a large amount of nutrients in that soil. As you continue to get along, the fact here you've now got a bit more of a windbreak, you've got greater nutrients, greater water holding capacity of the soil, you can now start to get other woodland plants growing and developing. So you start to get some of your eucalypt forests, okay, those open and closed woodlands eventually developing. And if there is enough depth, well, eventually you'll get to that rainforest community growing and developing. But it's all because of the work here of these pioneer plants. Now, if I know that a certain ecosystem does not have that space to enable that succession to occur in those particular zones, well, I know straight away that you'll never reach that climax community of the rainforest. And most sand islands, well, they'll reach a climax community that's stable, but it'll be an open woodland, okay, some sort of eucalypt forest there. So if you can have an understanding of the abiotic conditions and the species present and what they do in that particular role of succession, hopefully you'll be able to make some predictions about successional changes. So let's just have a go at the practice question just to end. So explain why being an R strategist would be an advantage to a pioneer species, but not to a plant in a climax community. So pause the video to have a go, think through yourself, and I'll go through a bit of an answer now. So being an R strategist would be an advantage for a pioneer species since they need to disperse rapidly and have large number of offsprings to survive in that harsh environment. And that's part of the quality of pioneer species, that they have that rapid seed germination and they're able to spread far to establish themselves in that harsh environment. Where this isn't an advantage for a plant that's in a climax community, because this community is stable and each species will have its own particular niche, and there's limiting factors in that environment which cause it to remain at its carrying capacity. So by being able to produce large amount of offsprings, well, that's not an advantage because there's already limiting factors at play which isn't enabling that many organisms to survive. So by being slow growing, okay, and being able to reach that greater size and maturity, well, that enables those climax plants to establish themselves there, where being an R strategist is an advantage for a pioneer plant because they can quickly spread and establish themselves in harsh condition, and they have that more J curve, that boom and bust, where here for climax community plants, they're going to have more of that logistic growth, that S curve. So hopefully, guys, this video has helped you understand some of those important features of pioneer plants, and also to understand what things you would expect to look for to help you predict successional outcomes. So considering what are the abiotic factors present in that environment, what organisms are there, and therefore what will happen over that time of succession.